name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to another episode of Can This Be Fixed with myself and our wonderful co-host, Mike DeZio. If you want to learn more about Mike, you can always check out his Instagram handle in the show notes. So on today's episode, we are going to talk about what happens if you do no contact with an avoidant attachment style and extra time passes in the windows we often talk about for when the avoidant will actually miss the relationship the most. So we'll dive into what those time periods are where no contact is the most effective at sort of causing your ex to maybe miss you or feel for you. We'll also talk about how to make sure you're doing no contact properly, because it's not just about winning that other person back. It's actually about your own healing, clarity, perspective, growth primarily. And then sure, we can understand how these things affect other people and see if we can actually make the needle move in a healthy way. So we'll kick off the episode with this. And then Mike and I, for the second part of the episode today, are going to share personal dating stories, times that we felt jealous, specifically having been fearful avoidant in the past and dismissive avoidant. And we'll do a deep dive into some personal shares. We'll unpack jealousy and how it affects different attachment styles, specifically the avoidant ones. And we'll talk a little bit about criticism and feedback, and I'm hoping that some of you can relate to this experience, and also we'll share a little bit about what you can do. So I'll kick it off with the very first question. By the way, these questions are on our Reddit thread, Can This Be Fixed? You are welcome to share yours, post yours, any of that, so that you can get your question answered on here as well. So the question says, what if an ex-DA partner of 5+ years does not reach out in any way after 16 weeks? What I've learned from the past few years from Thais and PDS is that in the vast majority of cases, they reach out around the 3-month mark or so. My ex-DA would usually reach out in some small way after every discard. So I think I'll kick this one off, if that's okay with you, Mike, just to sort of fill in the blanks here about this. So what basically ends up happening, and what this wonderful person is referencing, is that a lot of times when dismissive avoidants leave a relationship or pull away, if in particular the person who gets broken up with in the relationship goes no contact almost immediately and stays no contact consistently. And by the way, what no contact means is like no contact, no texts, no phone calls, no, indirect contact through looking at their social media stories or liking things or posting things that they can see on a regular basis, anything that's tagging them or anything like that, those are all breaking no contact. So we want to be like completely no contact at all. It's okay if you post something on your own social media. If they're there, just don't tag them in it. Now, what you'll generally see is that because dismissive avoidants operate in their feelings minus their fears, when their fears get really strong, they can pull away very strongly. But when instead somebody goes no contact with them, you'll see that there's nothing to fear, right? Because their fears are not being triggered. They're not fearing being trapped or engulfed or in the wrong relationship where they have to be too vulnerable. Like all those fears that they were assuming or projecting or wondering about or worrying about, they're gone because now you're no contact. You're nowhere to be seen or found. And so that allows them to get into a space where they anchor more into their feelings and emotions. And that's usually when you'll see them come back. But they have this numbing period first. And that numbing period generally lasts from about 6 weeks at the minimum, all the way to up to 3 months. And so you won't see them you go no contact for 2 weeks and suddenly they're reaching out. Generally, it's a lot longer than that. But I think some really important things we'll have to cover, and I'll pass this over to you, Mike, and then maybe I'll come back and cover some of these things, are just, what happens if they don't reach out? What does that mean? And what are some things that you should do if they do reach out to know how to best handle that situation? So I'll pass this over to you, Mike, and then maybe I'll jump in and add some more things at the end.
Yeah, just great things that you shared there for sure. And that makes a lot of sense for avoidance. For myself, I know I've had a few of these types of relationships where it was off and on, break up, get back together, break up, get back together. And I have a feeling this might be sort of the last straw where maybe this person's like, you know what, this is not the person for me. I don't think this will be able to come back from whatever's been happening between us. There's just, I think DAs at some point kind of just give up, or they're like, you know what, we're not sort of getting along. I mentioned this before in the past. A lot of DAs think that there's this perfect person out there for them. So a lot of times they can find flaws in the person in front of them and try to find reasons of why it won't work. So I just have a feeling this time around, if they're not reaching out after the 3 months mark or so, this might be a case of them sort of saying, you know what, this person's not for me. And I might want to be looking out for someone else, and possibly they found someone else. Not 100% sure, obviously, but that's sort of what it sounds like to me. So if this person did want to reach out to them to get some finality, what were sort of your tips on what sort of should be said to the person to sort of find out, hey, is this over or not over? Like, what do you think is a good strategy this person can do to at least find out where they stand? Because, you know, it's not fair when somebody is in a limbo period and not knowing what the other person's feeling or thinking. So sort of what do you think is the best way to go about getting that information from an avoidant person?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, first and foremost, I just want to say I agree with you. I think that when there's 5 years and there's lots of on and off periods, and then somebody doesn't reach out at all, and you're past 16 weeks, honestly, at that point, it usually is like kind of the end of the road. And a lot of times it's that there's been so many times that things are on and off, and maybe a lot of things have been unresolved. And, part of the reason that I believe so much in getting good at communication and learning to resolve conflict is because every time there's a conflict that's unresolved. So let's say that you have two people and they're angry about something, and then you kind of just get mad, don't talk to each other, brush it under the rug, and then later, move on and pretend like everything's okay. I really believe that every time we don't resolve something, we're actually just building an invisible wall between ourselves and somebody else. And so if you have all these times where the relationship broke down, got back together, broke down, got back together, and you never went back and had the chance to work on like those real foundational parts, like, hey, this is what's come up for me. Here's what's going on. What happened for you in that particular situation? Like, what were our feelings around the situation? What do we need to resolve this? And how can we improve and prevent this from happening again in the future? If we're not having those conversations, and, to our wonderful user that posted this, like, it sounds to me like you're trying to do the work, right? You said you've been like reading and listening to PDS related things, like you're trying to do the work, but that person has to be doing the work too. If it's just one-sided, it will always become unfair and unjust. So, there's a good chance that this person's just sort of like, they have all these invisible walls they've built because maybe they're not communicating their needs or their feelings, and they're not feeling resolved. And so maybe they got to that sort of end of the rope. So, going into what you just asked, Mike, what can we do in this situation? Well, the very first thing I would say is I would put all of my effort into assuming that person is not coming back at all. And it sounds like there's been a history of that person reaching out every time they would pull away. But I'm a big believer that, like, if you break up as a couple and you get back together once, we want to start being on high alert. Like, are we actually resolving problems? If it happens a second time, I would often advise people to really be cautious about getting back together. I don't even think that it's necessarily the right path sometimes. If it happens a third time, there's a third breakup, to me, like, you're just going to keep going back around the same situations and experiences over and over again. Like, I think we can have chances for people, but I think eventually, if this is a pattern or a theme in a relationship, it does damage every time that people break up and pull away. And so it just becomes something that I don't recommend even going back through. So I would spend all of my time here. I would do a deep dive into healing from the breakup, really moving through like the principles of how to heal from a breakup, which have a lot to do with working through our core wounds or limiting beliefs that come up, meeting the needs that this person met in our lives, so that we feel like there's not that void being left behind from them. And then if the person does come back and it's this sort of delayed comeback where they resurface even like another couple months from now, I would do my best to hold my boundaries and not go back into that dynamic. And I would let the person know, like, hey, obviously we've had a long history. If there's something you still need for closure, you're welcome to have that conversation. But I would really try to hold my boundaries, because it sounds to me like you're the person and you're doing the work, trying to learn, and that person keeps, you even use the word discard, like keeps pulling away in the relationship, not making an effort, and then suddenly coming back as if like you're just supposed to be there. And that's where it becomes unfair. That's where it becomes really tricky long term. to just keep going through that dynamic. So I would go into your healing, focus on you, everything that you need to do to heal, to get a new support system in place, make a list of all the needs that person was meeting, come up with new strategies to meet those needs. That helps heal the grief of a breakup much faster. And then if that person does come back, I would be prepared for how to have that conversation in a way that holds boundaries should they surface, another few weeks or months later from now, but I would not hold out hope. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Mike?
I just wanted to throw something out there for FAs who go through the cycle of breaking up, getting back together, breaking up, getting back together. Is that something that's sort of comfortable to them because they grew up in a chaotic environment to have these sort of high emotional swings of like, we're close now, but now we're breaking up, but then we come back together in this passionate, emotional, reconnection? Is that something that the FA can sort of be blind to and like, hey, this is okay. Like, this is kind of how relationships work. It's like, high emotion, and sometimes we're pushing each other away, but then there's other times where we're loving each other like so deeply. So is that something that like an FA might not go into like the core problems and just think, hey, this is sort of the way relationships function?
100%. And honestly, fearful avoidance can be the ones doing that sometimes. They can even be the ones like initiating it. So it's a subconscious. One of the things that fearful avoidance do, and I've had this conversation with so many people, and this was my experience too, is back before I like learned about this stuff in more detail, did a lot of inner work and inner healing and like back to when I hadn't really worked on myself or knew much about what was going on in my own internal world, I would push people away so much in relationships, and maybe not always like fully break up, but like try to insinuate, like almost like in a, like, I don't know if this is working. Like, I'd make those comments and throw them out. And, my relationship to it, first of all, I did not have conscious awareness of how like painful and damaging that was to people. Like, I really regret that I behaved that way. I even called people when I started to realize about this stuff years and years ago and like apologized for my behavior. I was like, oh, I was kind of mean sometimes. Anyway, so I think that there's that, but my experience, and I'm just going to speak for myself, but I've had lots of conversations with fearful avoidants who say that basically the same thing is in those moments that you're in pain, you are like really in pain because you've got a lot of triggers and they run deep. And when you can't figure out how to get rid of the pain, the only thing that feels normal is like, I need to push this person as far away as possible, because by doing that, I'm then putting myself in a position where I can get rid of this pain. And so it's like I'm pushing the person away. It really is a subconscious strategy to push the pain away. But then sometimes it's like you push somebody away so much that it's like later on you're going, that was like a little bit of an overkill there. Like that was too much. And you may regret it when you come out of that really triggering event or space. So not only will dismissive avoidance do that, but fearful avoidance will often do that too. But to your point, 100% for a fearful avoidant, if they're on the receiving end of this, because they have that comfort zone around chaos, they may think that this is normal or acceptable or okay.
Right. One last thing I wanted to mention, in those times where an FA does have sort of a bit of a blow up and is trying to create that space, they can sometimes sort of go for the jugular and say things that are maybe not, to them is not a big deal, but DA can be quite sensitive, right? So they can sort of take it a little more personally and not realize like NFA is sort of just doing this as a defense mechanism to create space. I think a lot of DAs, and in this case that this user question pointed out, is I think DAs might give up after a while where they're like, you know what, this person doesn't accept the way that I am. It doesn't matter what I do. It seems like we always come back to the same place where it's sort of my fault and I'm not doing things right and I'm screwing up. A lot of times the DA is not accepting who they are themselves. So they think that somebody else is not accepting them, but really they have to do the inner work to start accepting themselves and realize that, okay, this other person does accept you. They don't think you're like totally a screw up and terrible in a relationship. And if there is a fight or an issue, that's just something that needs to be worked out. It's not like an attack on your character saying that, the DA, you're the flawed one, you're the reason why this always happens. Like, I need to get away from you. So point being there is DAs have to work on self-acceptance. And then partners of DAs have to realize that they do have acceptance sort of issues and just let them know, the ways that they are doing things right. Because yes, there's a lot of things DAs do wrong, but there's also things that are very sensitive. They can be thoughtful sometimes. They can be very sweet. There's things they do right as well. So just make sure in any argument that you're not just you might be attacking someone's character and they're thinking, oh, this is who they think I am at my core. And that's really hard to rebound from. And, it's almost pointless where you feel like, why am I going to go back when this person thinks I'm so deeply flawed that, we can't even get along. So I just want to make that point, if that's helpful to the user question.
Yeah, and like the person may be like not doing that, like they don't really give a whole lot of context on that part, but it's such a common theme that you're getting at with like FAs and DAs where FAs feel frustrated or hurt and then they hold it in and they pretend like they're fine and then it comes out in a not so great way, and DAs are already so sensitive to that, and then it can just be a spiral, and it even happens with like anxious preoccupieds in various ways too. But APs will tend to be a little more gentle with their words, whereas fearful avoidance can be a little more ferocious or fiery sometimes with how they communicate. So such an important point you made, just to be mindful of those communication pieces, because they can really cause the relationship some suffering over time.
For sure.
Awesome. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we are going to share, we'll still do one more user question, but we are going to share a time that when we were fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant, we felt jealous on dates. So we'll be right back. I just wanted to pop in here and let you know we are doing a 7-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below. Welcome back to Can This Be Fixed? So we are still going to talk about relationships with avoidant attachment styles and answer another user question, but we figured that we would do a personal share. So as I mentioned earlier, I was a fearful avoidant attachment style for a long time. Mike was a dismissive avoidant, and we decided that we are going to share vulnerable stories of times that we felt the most jealous on a date that we can remember. So if you want to kick it off, Mike, I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, sure. This is like a funny story. It has a funny ending to it, but at the time, I guess it wasn't super funny. But it was 20 years ago plus, so I'll give myself a bit of grace. So I was dating a girl for about maybe a couple months, 2-3 months, and we decided to go out to a bar together. We went to the bar, and it turns out that her ex-boyfriend was there with his friends. This was her first boyfriend. They had been together for like 5 years, like very long relationship, right? They had a long history together. And this was her first time seeing him in like, I don't know, months, possibly even up to a year. So I noticed that she was sort of looking over to see what he was doing a couple times. And I didn't say anything, but I was starting to get upset. I was thinking like, why does she keep looking over at him? Meanwhile, now that I think about it, it's like, gee, she had such a long history with the guy, and this is her first time seeing him, so she's probably pretty shocked, I think anybody would naturally be doing the same thing. Anyway, my core wounds were flaring up, and I was thinking, oh, I'm being disrespected. I'm not good enough. She wants to be with him. So anyway, I finally blew up, and I said, I'm leaving right now. Like, this is too much, and you just keep looking over, and this is unacceptable. So I stormed out of the bar, walked all the way home, and she had followed me home. So she came up to my place, and I was still like 10 out of 10 upset and just really overreacting and, trying to make her feel the same pain that I felt by being mean and cold and telling her to get out of my apartment. And I eventually told her, like, you're not sleeping over. Just please get out of here. Leave me alone. Leave my house. And she had picked up McDonald's on the walk home, and, she left, and that was that. I woke up the next morning and I went to go to my car, and I looked at the side of my car, and McChicken McDonald's had been smeared all over the right side of my car. And I just laughed because, you know, it was the morning and it was all the emotions had died down and I kind of like had a chuckle, but it made me reflect like, oh man, like I must have been really unreasonable last night and not forgiving. So, you know, in my jealousy, I created a really sort of uncomfortable situation. I see now why it happened, but for sure that was probably the most like jealous I've ever been. And then had that kind of retaliation, which was funny at the time.
So interesting. So wait, something that just came to me that's really interesting that I have to ask you. I
Yeah.
would say that because obviously like I was in client practice for a long time and saw lots and lots of people and all the inside of so many people's lives. I would say if I had to splice it apart, I would say there's a pattern of probably 80% of dismissive avoidants who don't even really ever seem to feel jealous. Like literally
Mhm.
don't really seem to feel jealous, don't seem to express it. And then about 20% of those that kind of do, and they do experience jealousy, but
Yeah.
of that 20%, 10% don't even really express it. And since we've had these conversations here, I'm like, oh, it's interesting. Like, you know, you and I have been good friends for like more than a decade, like known each other for longer than that. And in my experience, or at least like chatting in here, you have in these old stories when you were like, you know, 10, I don't know how many years ago some of these stories are, but they seem to be like much, you said this one was like when you were 20 something. So like quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And you seem to have like a pattern of feeling jealous in relationships. So will you talk to our listeners about like what that was like for you for a moment as a DA at the time? And also what your relationship to jealousy was like? Because I think a lot of dismissive avoidants don't even seem to express that.
Yeah, I guess I must be the minority then, but I know for myself, like I just spend so much time already thinking that I'm like hanging on by a thread that like, oh, I'm lucky that this person even wants to be with me and they're not seeing sort of how messed up I am or how defective I am or, you know, how sort of broken I am in my core. So when I would see someone giving attention to another person, I would immediately feel threatened. I'd think, oh no, like if they start to talk to that person, start to get to know them, they're naturally going to gravitate towards them. They're going to think that's the better choice. They're going to think that person's more put together. That person's more emotionally aware. That person has more drive and self-confidence and self-esteem. I sort of compared myself down to everyone. I sort of felt like I was beneath a lot of sort of healthy people. So I guess jealousy was almost like the fear that I'm going to lose the person. So it would be just such a strong feeling of worrying that they're going to pick someone else, that, you know, these emotions would come up. And sometimes I wouldn't express it eloquently. And I kind of get really pissed off.
Thanks
So
for sharing that. Yeah. And do you think that like it would just come out at random times, like, oh, just a couple of times and we just happen to be talking about those stories, or would you most often express it outwardly? Or would that be something that like you would really try not to show and then every so often you would?
yeah, I think I'd probably try not to, because again, that's, you know, we also sometimes shame ourselves for the way we're feeling. You know,
Yeah.
thinking, oh, that's not attractive to have a boyfriend who's jealous or worried all the time or possessive. So I probably would stop it a lot of the times. Um, but I felt when there was a connection between my partner at the time and this other person, so maybe it was like an ex-boyfriend or an ex-lover or something like that, that was the one that sort of stung the most, and that I would really get like panicky and feel like I have to like, you know, say something or, you know, express my fear and worry. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I just want to say for anybody listening who's like, wait, but Mike feels afraid of losing the partner and the connection. So Mike wasn't a DA, because I know people are probably thinking that. For the record, for anybody who is curious about that, when we look at how attachment styles portray themselves, we're looking at, you know, dismissive avoidants are not robots, right? Neither are fearful avoidants. Like, well, everybody knows that because fearful avoidants express a lot of emotion, but dismissive avoidants are not robots. They can still feel anxious. They can still feel afraid of abandonment or somebody choosing somebody else or pulling away. But what you'll just see is that when they feel like that, they tend to deactivate, which you can clearly see in your story, right? You feel like that. And instead of trying to cling or get closer to the person because of it, you leave the bar. You're like, hey, I need you to leave. I need space because you're feeling that. So you can see the avoidant expression in how you're coping. But it's just interesting that you're expressing the jealousy outwardly. Because oftentimes like dismissive ones be like, I don't feel jealous, I don't feel anything, I don't notice anything. And I
Yeah.
wonder, how much of the time, some people will say like, oh yeah, I feel jealous, but I would never show it or things like that. And I wonder how much of the time like clients even told me that they didn't feel jealous because they didn't even want me to know that they were experiencing that emotion.
Yeah, exactly right. Like there is that deep shame for that, even, with a therapist. But I should mention one thing, and maybe this will sort of alter what you were just mentioning. There was alcohol involved in this situation. So I know a lot of people on avoidance, especially, can actually like bring out emotions and
Very
bring out
true.
things that they always wanted to say and be a little more brave with being vulnerable. So I think the alcohol probably had a big effect with that. I felt a little more comfortable and the filter was sort of off and just kind of let things fly. So yeah, I pose it back to you. Do you think avoidance probably with alcohol, it sort of throws off the whole traditional DA behaviors and how they would normally react in situations?
I think that's such a good assessment. I have to tell you, I can't say like a for sure yes or no answer because like I would see people in a sober context all the time, like, client sessions and they come in and I never see. But
Yeah.
avoidance that I have known personally, like obviously my husband, when we first met, like he was, more dismissive avoidant. I noticed that with him. I have had many, many friends growing up that were like avoidant who are very, very close friends. And for sure, consistently without exception, when they drink, they're way more emotionally expressive. And you get this like emotional, like more available side of them. And, I'd often notice sometimes like how juxtaposed it was when they were sober versus drinking.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
of course, if that translates to all the other emotions, it should translate to the expression of jealousy as well. So
For sure.
yeah, it's so
The
interesting.
DA core wounds kind of get nullified for that period of a few hours. You don't feel defective. You feel pretty awesome. You don't feel like you're disconnected. You're actually connecting with people. You don't see people as kind of threats, and you see people as more like together and loving. So it is interesting. I'm not saying go out there if you're an avoidant and go drink because there's some definitely negative consequences to that. But it is really interesting to see that you can almost like turn those things off temporarily in those states.
Absolutely. It's so interesting. And I think core wounds I don't know how to put it into words because I'm just kind of thinking it out loud, but there's almost like two parts. It's like core wounds originally feel diminished, but then if something does still get triggered, sometimes you get like a little more fired up than you would otherwise. So it's kind of like a
Yeah,
double-edged sword. Like there's like benefits in that sense, but then there's drawbacks if something actually does hurt you. I don't know, at least for me back in the day when I was in the space that I was in and doing stuff all the time and going out all the time and all these sorts of things, I definitely would feel like drinking and using any other drinks, drugs, substances, anything wasn't conducive for me behaving better.
yeah,
Yeah, I feel like I was definitely more, it almost feels like it would magnify core wounds or magnify the expression of them at least when they were touched.
yeah. That should be an episode on its own, like alcohol and the effect on each of the attachment styles.
I know, but I don't have enough like data or like information on that because I would only ever like see people like when I pull from all these things, it's like, all the things I would see over and over and over again with clients and people. And I
Yeah,
never really saw enough. I had a couple clients over the years come into sessions like not sober, and I'd be like, whoa, what's going on here? I've definitely had some like very interesting moments with a few different people. But um yeah, it's a crazy thing. Crazy
yeah,
thing for sure.
super interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, what was your jealousy story? What happened to you
It's
in that?
funny. The one that came to mind is kind of similar to yours in a way, but it's like it's almost like not fully typical fearful avoidance. So I was at a restaurant that would like turn into this sort of nightclub, and it was at the time that I was living in Miami. And I was there and with somebody I was dating and living with at the time. And this is just like the randomest one too, the randomest story. But there was this girl, she was the waitress, and she was like being so friendly with my partner. And she kept like putting her arm on his leg for like long periods of time. And like, it was like, and I just remember feeling so fired up about it. Like for a second time, I was kind of like, okay, like this lady's like a touchy-feely person. And then I started noticing like it's not with everyone else, it's just with him. And then it just started getting for like longer and longer. And I just got so angry and frustrated. And I just got up and I was like, oh, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And for me at the time, I did not, for the life of me, know how to communicate. Like I could not be vulnerable. I was probably FA leaning DA at that point in my life. And I couldn't be vulnerable. I didn't know how to talk about anything. So like in typical fearful avoidant fashion, I would like, I was going to take my anger to the grave. And then it doesn't actually work like that. So it would come out in a different way about something totally unrelated. Like 3 hours later, I'd be so mad for like something else because I couldn't talk about the things that actually made me feel hurt. I didn't know how. Like there was just this deep, deep block for me. And so I was not going to be able to talk about it. I knew I had to get out of there because I knew that I was just so angry, but I didn't want to show any emotion. And I think you and I were talking about this recently. I was talking about this with somebody recently. And as a fearful avoidant, I think a lot of what fearful avoidants experience, and this was definitely my experience, is like you feel all this emotion. You're like, okay, I can't talk about it. And especially if you feel like somebody's hurting you, the last thing you want to do is like let them know they hurt you because they're hurting you. So now why would you be vulnerable to somebody who's hurting you? And I was angry at him that he wasn't like doing something or trying to stop it in some way or anything like that. So I just like swallowed it, said I had to go to the bathroom, literally left out this like back exit and just left. And I was there with like a group of people I was very close with and at the time, and I left, didn't come back. And then like 15, 20 minutes later, everybody's calling me and I was like not answering calls. Like I just didn't know what I was even going to say or do. But like, and I honestly don't even remember how the situation happened. Or like what unfolded next or how it resolved. Knowing me, I probably would have like still tried to come up with some kind of reason. Okay, I have another story where I do remember how it resolved. It just came to mind. But so that was that story. I just left because I was so angry and I didn't know how to talk about it. And probably I would have said that I had to leave for some other reason and been mad about something else later because that would have been par for the course. I do actually remember another time where in the same situation, the person I was dating before we lived together was living with his roommate. And there was like a girl and a guy. There were two roommates. And the girl, I remember one time being so over the top flirtatious. She was like a very unique individual. Like she had a lot of things I think she had to sort out. And so did I at the time. So not judging, but it made for a complicated scenario. Anyways, I remember feeling upset by that as well. And this, I do remember how it ended. And I remember walking out of the house saying that I had to take a phone call and like literally not returning. And then I waited for like 2 hours. And I think what happened is that person I was dating probably thought, oh, she's taking a phone call. Like, why is she talking to somebody for 2 hours? And then he got suspicious and kind of jealous and uncomfortable. And I had to leave it like that. I wasn't going to say anything about how the situation made me feel. And I knew that then that's what he was feeling because he was like, who are you talking to for so long? Like, what's going on? Like, it's kind of late in the evening. Like, why are you? And he's asking me all these things. And I was just like, oh, like it's personal. It was a personal thing. And I just wouldn't answer the questions. And that's how I would cope at the time. And that's all I knew how to do because I didn't know how to have conversations or communicate.
Right. That's so interesting. I feel like FAs have to deal with so many layers and so many like thoughts and things and triggers in the moment that it's just really hard to understand, what I should be doing best. So I want to know as well, and I believe this to be true, is one of the fears too that you're going to have like an overreaction. Like you might say something in front of the group and you're worried that it's going to come out too strong and then everyone's going to look at you and be like, whoa, like insecure much? Like, is it because you're not used to setting boundaries and being maybe a little more assertive? Is there a worry that you're going to have an overreaction and then just kind of ruin the mood of the table?
Yeah, it's a little complex for sure, but the honest answer is it depends on what it's about. So sometimes as an FA, I would feel like I was taking my power back and I was standing up for myself and I should be overreacting and watch out for me because I can be feisty. Like sometimes there was a part when I would be angry where I could be like really intense and I would feel like I wanted people to know that they couldn't mess with me. Like, I'll be really nice, but then like if it gets to that point, I'll give you a really hard time. And sometimes I wanted that to happen. Like I wasn't afraid to overreact in front of people if I felt like it was stopping me from feeling so powerless, I think is what it was really boiling down to in those moments. And other times, it was more like if it was something that I thought was embarrassing. So like, oh, it's shameful to be jealous. Like, don't show weakness. Like, oh, that's too vulnerable, sort of sharing in like those emotions that a DA would feel, that it's like, that's not appropriate, or that's embarrassing, or you're weak, or you're insecure. And so that I would be like, I can never show that I feel that way. And looking back on like, before I like started really doing the work on myself at like 20 or so, before that, all of the relationships I had, and mind you, like most of them, I'm like a teenager, like they're, you know, how serious can they be at that time? But most of those relationship dynamics, I don't think I ever outwardly expressed that I felt jealous. Like, I think I probably seemed like I never did, because I think I would just like keep that to myself, probably never
Yeah.
say it out loud, probably never felt like I had a situation resolve in those particular cases.
Yeah.
And so that was that. Like, I would just keep those in and hold them down, and
Yeah.
yeah. So it's interesting because it could really go like either polarity for me at the time.
Yeah, exactly. I have one last thing to mention because we're on the topic of jealousy, and I think the audience might be able to relate as well, or might learn from this. So in the past, this hasn't happened in probably in the last 10 years or so, but in the past, a lot of times I dated girls, and if I go out with the boys, like a boys' night out, yeah, like we might talk to a couple girls, or there might be girls around or in the vicinity, but you're just out, you're being social or whatever. But I don't go home and I'm like, my girlfriend asks, "Oh, how was your night?" And I'm like, "Oh, we talked to this one girl. She was so pretty. Like, wow, like, I couldn't believe it." Like, I'm just not filling in the details that I don't find irrelevant and might make someone feel a little insecure. But I found a lot of girls would come home, and when they had their girls' night, and they would fill me in on these like really detailed stuff, like, "Oh yeah, we met these cool guys. They're all from a junior hockey team. They bought us all drinks or whatever." And I'm just kind of like, "Why are you telling me all this? Like, unless something really bad happened, let me know. Like if somebody touched you or did something really inappropriate." But they would always just share these details with me, and I'm thinking, are you trying to make me jealous right now? Like, is this your way of like, maybe because I'm avoidant, like I'm not really showing you a lot of like closeness and emotional lovey-dovey, and by saying that, then it's going to elicit a reaction, and they can be like, okay, he does care, because it's not obvious that he cares. Does that
Almost certainly. I
okay?
would probably say it's like 80-20 split, because I've had a lot of these conversations over the years with women,
Yeah.
with friends, with clients, like lots of different like walks of when this happens.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of times if I was like that. I'm sure I probably had moments of being like that. I don't know. I was
Mm.
probably like a lot more avoidant in some of my earlier relationships. And then by the time I met Graham, I had like done a lot of work. But with conversations I've had like this, for sure, and I don't know like which people you were dating, what their attachment styles probably were, but for sure, I think anxious preoccupieds tend to do that a little bit. I'm sure fearful avoidants do that too at times.
Yeah.
Probably about 80% of the time, it's, hey, like poke, like elicit a reaction and see if there is any.
Yeah.
Especially if you're more avoidant and they can't tell like what you're feeling. And
Yeah.
20% of the time, I think it might be like this guilt or this like need to be like overly transparent. Like, oh, we kind of talk to these people, so let me just tell you everything because, and like get it off my chest. And I've definitely had conversations with people like that, like, oh, I really told them that we like talked to these guys when we went out. And I've had friends who've sort of said that to their partners.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, like, I'm thinking of one person in particular, like, you didn't do anything wrong. So like you probably don't have to give every little detail. Like you weren't the one like talking to these people, and you're probably just making your partner feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting though. It's like I think honestly, if people are like listening and they're going, so then what do you do in these particular situations? I think one of the best things to do is like get a clear picture of what your partner is looking for around situations like that, so we can be respectful. Like I really believe, and I believe this is a part of healthy relationships, that like men should have time with the boys, or women should have time with their girls, or wherever you're standing, you should have time with your friends, right? Like I think that that's an important thing to support in relationships no matter what. But I also think that some people are like, don't tell me anything, I don't even want to know anything at all. And some people are like, I need to know everything and feel included, because if you're being ambiguous, then that's a trigger. So like how can you best support your partner if you're insecurely attached, and how can they best support you to have the easiest time in doing things with their friends and carving out time for friendships? And
Yeah.
in order to do that, like have a conversation about what each person's looking for. Because I think
Yeah.
otherwise it can be like, hey, why are you telling me all these details? And what would you do in those situations when somebody would be like that? Would you react or would you just kind of shut down?
I can't remember because it's been so long, but I think I'm even feeling the feeling right now. I'm just like, are you telling me this? Like,
I
I was not
noticed.
worried I was not worried the whole evening that you were out. And then now that you're telling me these stories, I'm like, oh geez, like now every time you go out, I have to worry about, all these guys around you all the time and this and that, and the other happening. Like realistically, I know if you're an attractive person and you're around your attractive friends, you're probably going to attract men or people of the opposite sex or people who are attracted to you to come up to you. That's just a simple fact of life. I just hope, they're not going to go far with it and go home with the person or get the person's phone number or anything like that. So I'm of the camp, like I'd rather not know unless it's something that you think is going to affect the relationship or, me and your dynamic. But if it was just simply talking to someone of the opposite sex, like that's 50% of the population is the opposite sex. So you're bound to talk to some people while you're out and about it, like in a social environment. So I'm of the camp I'd rather not know. Yeah.
Did you ever say to people that you were talking to, so like whoever they're attracted to, did you ever say to people like, hey, I don't want to know if you're talking to other people? Or
Yeah, I think I got a little irritated and let that be known.
yeah.
I can't remember if they never did it ever again, but yeah, I think I probably said like, I don't need to know all that. Like that's sort of
Yeah.
but then like you said, like everybody's different and maybe they think sharing is wonderful to share the whole aspect of the evening, like not hiding this part and sharing this part, hiding that part. So, I guess there's no right and wrong, but like you mentioned before, if you have a conversation about it and once you know your partner's sort of jealousy triggers, then you can kind of weave your way around those. So,
I want to tell you one more thing on this topic. So I had this friend, really, really good friend. She is DA and went to school with her and all these different things and like really great person. And we worked while we were in school, we worked at the kind of restaurant bar thing. And like everybody there was like pretty awesome and everybody got along for the most part. But like every once in a while, like you're in that kind of space and people can be kind of gossipy or things like that. And I
sure.
remember somebody like said something about her and I really like defended her. And I came home and we were roommates and I told her like, hey, like this person said this about you. And I don't remember what it was. It was probably something small.
Mhm.
And I remember her saying to me, and she was DA, I don't want to know if people talk about me, just don't tell me. And I
Interesting.
remember thinking like, that's really interesting because I would friggin' want to know so that I
Yeah.
could like defend myself or say something or hash it out with that person or something. And I remember just being so surprised by that and being like, what? But now in retrospect, like this is before I was really learning about any of this stuff, like attachment styles and the subconscious mind and how these things work. I'm like, oh, interesting. Like that makes sense to me that she as a DA at the time would have like, you know, not wanted to hear anything that's going to make her feel bad. Like, why bother? And I'm
Yeah.
curious what your stance would be on that because that's something I never asked another person.
Yeah, right away this popped in my head. Before, I would not want any criticism of anything from anyone. So, for example, the best example in your job, a lot of jobs have 6 month performance reviews, 1 year performance reviews. I would hate those with a passion because I just didn't want to hear anything negative that I was doing. I already felt like worried that myself wasn't good enough and defective, that I felt like any further criticism was like pouring hot
For the
acid.
soul. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like really hurtful. So yeah, even in presentations, like even in business where you should want feedback to better your product or whatever, like I didn't want any like market research. I didn't want anybody. If you want to tell me how amazing I was and how great I was, sure, please, I'll hear that all day. But at the time back then, I didn't want to hear any criticism. So that makes sense, the story you told me about your friend.
Yeah.
Now, though, I've completely changed my relationship to criticism. Even the word criticism, you could just swap that for feedback.
Yeah.
And when someone's giving you feedback, they actually care enough to show you some things that you might have not noticed or might have not seen. And then the beauty of feedback is you can take it if you think it's valid and be like, wow, you know what? That's a really good suggestion. Or you can be like, nah, you know what? Like, I think the way it is fine. And then you don't change it at all. So yeah, it's interesting how GAs can be really averse to criticism and not want to hear anything bad that people are already saying, because it hurts way too much.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It's so interesting because there's a great quote, and I would write all these quotes down and keep them and like reread them. And then I never wrote where they were from. So I have all these quotes in my head and I have no idea who said them, but I read a quote in a book somewhere once and it said, criticism is an immense gift for anybody interested in self-realization. And it's true. Like you said, exactly. You can consider it. You can take it into consideration. Like, okay, is this true for me? Is there something I can course correct here? Is there something I can grow from? Or is this just like untrue and this is like the person projecting onto me? And if you're really willing to consider, it's actually a beautiful thing. But when we have our wounds and our stuff in the way, then it becomes really hard.
Yeah. And it also goes back to like when someone actually tells you something that you're not seeing completely and everybody's afraid to say it, sometimes that one person who delivers that to you is literally like life-changing. Like it's something you just had such a blind spot about, but then they're giving you the gift. Like obviously if they say it nicely and respectfully, it can be such a gift because it could be something that you just were not seeing and just maybe a habit or a behavior that you're doing unconsciously. And then when it's pointed out, you can actually make change about it. So sometimes telling someone something that's a little uncomfortable can be like the biggest gift you can give them. So
I completely agree. I feel like we should do a whole episode just on criticism and jealousy. I feel like it's such a great topic. So we'll try to look out and scout for some questions going into next week's episode about that. If anybody has any questions that they want to put on this, please post them to Can This Be Fixed? Is there anything you want to add before we wrap?
No, I'm still voting for the alcohol and attachment styles episode.
Please.
I don't even drink anymore. Like I literally do not drink. Before I had to drink to like go out and feel normal and not feel like a complete weirdo. But now in the last year or so, I've been going out totally sober, and it's amazing the people that you attract. You're thinking it would be such a challenge, but when you shift that, you can actually be yourself more, and then meet people who are more in line with you and your authentic self. So
I love that. Such a great share. So that's it for today. Stay tuned for next week's episode. You can follow Mike on social media. His socials are in the links down below. You can post your own questions. We'd love to hear from you if there's any questions you have, or if you liked Mike's suggestion about avoidant attachment styles and alcohol and have personal shares or questions around that we'll do our best to get some good info on. And feel free to share anything else in there personally under the Can This Be Fixed Reddit thread, where we will unpack your questions week over week and do some personal shares. Also, don't forget to follow us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast, or if you're listening to this on audio, check us out for the full video episodes on YouTube. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth, and thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.